I think of us in terms of the United States or just this mass of humans. I think of us as a superorganism, and I think if you had an organism that had a broken knee, you would go, well, I got to fix that knee. I can't just give that knee less work. Is it possible to fix the knee? Yeah, well, let's fix the knee. You don't want to just give the knee less work. You don't want to make it easier for the knee to get by. What you want to do is like strengthen it. So my thought, and I've said this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but if you really wanted to make America great again, right? You really wanted to make America great, what you would want to do is have less losers. So you'd want to go and find these places where people are in these economically deprived areas where there's a ton of crime and violence, and they don't have like a real good sense of like a potential positive outcome from where they're at, and transform that. With a fraction of the money that we spend trying to rebuild nations and invading Afghanistan, we could invest in many of our gigantic problems that we have in inner cities and completely rebuild them. It could be done. I mean, and it could have radical implications on the entire country as a whole. If you have, instead of like a place like Baltimore, for instance, right? I had Michael Woods on, who was a former police officer in Baltimore, and he sort of explained all of the different issues that happened in Baltimore, particularly where there was areas where they literally weren't selling homes to black people. They would not sell homes. Like this is like a white-only area. Like they had systematic racism built into the system for a long time. And just if someone just invested money into the United States government. If we systematically invested money into these places and rebuilt them with community centers, places where people could go where they were safe, staff them with a ton of people that were motivated, counselors, people that wanted to help, give them activities, give them skills and trades, and show them ways out. Give them, design it. That's not nearly as impossible as trying to rebuild Afghanistan or nation building. But we're doing that. We're doing that all over the place. I mean, Halliburton got no-bid contracts for billions of dollars to do shit that we don't even know what the fuck they were doing over there, right? If we could have a fraction of that money and invest it into inner cities, you could literally change entire generations of human beings that are coming out of there.
Couple things. One, by the way, I love the analogy of the busted knee, because in fact we used to make this mistake medically, right? Until recently, we didn't really understand that part of the healing process was not protecting the knee, but putting it through physical therapy that properly exposed it to stresses so that it rebuilt and came back strong. And so we are making that error, and we have made that error. In terms of what to do with the stratification of society in a way that locks up opportunity in some communities and not others, I think we should be honest with ourselves about why that happens. So I agree. You could make what would be massive investments in communities for a fraction of what we spend tinkering abroad in ways that have just spent huge amounts of treasure on projects that didn't work, right? So we could do that. The reason that doesn't happen, I don't think, has anything to do with it being inobvious that it would be a good thing to do. I think it has to do with the same group selection issue that we were talking about with respect to communism, which is to say, if you are at the top of the system, do you want to educate somebody else's kids to compete with yours? And so there's a reason that why do our public schools suck? Is it because we don't know how to make a school? I don't think so. I think it's because people know how to make a school when it's for their kids, and they're not so interested in making a school for other people's kids. And so this is a deep, chronic problem with our socio-political system. We have to confront that, and actually I think we have to come to agreement that actually it is in the long term wise to educate other people's kids, even if in the short term it's economically frightening.
Yeah, the big conspiracy about children and schools and keeping them stupid and making sure that the school system is frustrating, and I mean that's I've always felt like that conspiracy was really just, there's no motivation to make it better. I mean, and the when you look at the amount of money that teachers get paid, I mean, it's just disturbing. You think of the job of, I don't have to tell you, you're a goddamn teacher, but you got paid. Don't go about it that way, folks. But what we're talking about here is the most important thing that can happen to your child in the developmental phase, right? The education, like giving them a view of the world, explaining them all these things that they had not known before. Your first experiences with so many different subjects and topics and concepts come from your teachers. And I got really lucky, man. I mean, I went to a public school in high school in Newton, Massachusetts. I went to Newton South High School, and it was a really good school. And I still had shitty teachers. I still had, even in that really good school, comparatively really good, because I went to a school before that in Jamaica Plain, which was like an inner city school, and it was scary, real dangerous. Just not like the most dangerous in Boston, but very sketchy. 17-year-old kids in 7th grade that had never graduated, like violence, like a lot of weirdness. Like I had my head down, got through that year, and then all of a sudden I was in this, what we called Fast Times at Hebrew High, because it was like a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. Yeah. But it was, even then, there was still some terrible teachers there. It's just, the job is so important, and we in this country have done some weird thing where we've taken one of the most important jobs that you could ever hire someone to do, educate children, and made it almost like it's inconsequential.
Yeah, I'm hesitant. I'm not always hesitant about conspiracy. There are conspiracies, and we don't deal well with it. But one doesn't need conspiracy to explain this. This effectively can evolve without anybody's consciously thinking, I want to sabotage somebody else's kid's school. But I will say my experience in school was horrifying. School did not work for me. And maybe, every 5 teachers I hit one who invested and cared and took the time to scratch their head about why I wasn't succeeding. And
that must have had an impact on you, though, as an educator, though. You remember those people, those 1 out of 5.
Well, this is the funny thing, is while I was teaching, I taught for 14 years at Evergreen, and I felt like maybe I wasn't the only, but I was very nearly the only person on faculty anywhere that I could think of who had not been a good student. And but this was a very interesting window, because I became a professor because I loved science, and so the academy was where science happened, not because I wanted to be a teacher. My experience in school made me want to get away from the thing as fast as possible. But having had the experience of school completely failing, and to my own surprise, learning how to think without school, that's not where I learned it. I learned it primarily from my grandfather and my brother and other people in my environment who weren't associated with school. But once I got to being a professor, and I think this was only possible at Evergreen, Evergreen made no rules about what you did in the classroom, literally no rule about what subject you taught. They could hire you as a biologist, and you could teach dance if people showed up to take it.
Wow.
So you could teach whatever you wanted, and the key was you could teach in whatever way you wanted. And so
that's so crazy.
Well,
it seems like a great idea if you're super motivated.
It worked 2 ways. People abused it, and they would use it to reduce their workload to next to nothing, and they wouldn't invest in their students. And then other people looked at this, and it was glorious to have that kind of freedom. And so I taught in a way that would have worked for me if I had been a student there, which changed a lot of things. And it actually worked for a lot of, bad students don't typically become professors. So there's almost nobody on the faculty anywhere who has a clue why bad students are the way they are, right? They just don't intuit it because it wasn't their experience. But if you were like me and you were a bad student, and then you ended up with a class, suddenly all sorts of, bad students aren't uncommon. And so suddenly somebody who's speaking to them and says, I know that you're being a bad student isn't synonymous with you not having potential, right? That's really empowering for them. So anyway, it was an interesting experience. And my wife actually was a tremendous student. She loved school. And we would actually often teach the same students either together, or they would take my program and then they would bounce over to her program next. And so they would get these kind of two different views. And, each of us, we were both enlightened by our relationship with each other because, to the extent that I might have been dismissive of the great students, right? Here I had one who, was my closest person on earth. And, I got a window into how she saw the world, and she got a window into what the kids who weren't performing well in school might have been thinking. And so anyway, that was a very, very useful background to have for teaching.
There's a tremendous amount of power in teaching people. It's a weird relationship between, and especially when you're teaching someone and you're giving them credit towards their degree. I was a very poor student in high school, and I wasted a ton of time just going to college so people didn't think I was a loser. But I taught at Boston University. I used to teach Taekwondo, and I taught an accredited course. It was pass, fail, A, but it actually counted towards your GPA. So I had kids in my class, and I would tell them, it's really simple. Just try, and you get an A. Just show up and try, and I'll give you an A. Because athletics it's not fair. There's people that are just extreme endomorphs and their body holds on to too much fat. And they didn't have a background in any athletics. They're not flexible. It's very difficult for them to understand how to move their body correctly. It's essentially like trying to teach someone to be a professional speaker where someone has been speaking English their whole life where other people are just learning it for the first time. It didn't seem fair to me. So to judge them in terms of their actual outcome, that was it's almost contrary to what I said. I was giving them a quality of outcome, but not really.
No, I'm pretty sure I know what you were doing because I did the same thing. So I would tell students, you show up and try, and you are completely safe. You're going to get full credit, and you'll get a nice evaluation. We wrote written evaluations of them. But if you want an evaluation that raves about you, that talks about your extraordinary capacity, you're going to have to strive.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do, which sounds like what you were doing, is make them safe enough to discover what they could do. Because I don't know whether this will make sense to your audience or not, but I think we are overly concerned. We have been sold the idea that the job of a teacher is to assess how much the student has learned, that basically the job of the teacher is largely to report out to the world how qualified this person is. That's a very hard job in some disciplines. In mine, the student who did brilliantly, I would know. And the student who did nothing, I would usually know. But there were lots of students in the middle who might have gotten the lesson really deeply, and it might have matured over the course of 2 years after they were no longer in contact with me. At the point I was writing the evaluation of them, that might not have been a good place to assess how much they had actually learned. So I steered away from the idea that my job was to tell the world how well this person had done, unless they'd done great. If they'd done really well, if they'd, surprised themselves and me about everything that they were capable of. I loved saying that. But I didn't want to run down a student who hadn't really shined in the classroom because it was a totally artificial moment to judge how much they had picked up.
Yeah, no need to run them down.
Yep.
And again, everybody's starting off at a different position. It's not like everybody's on the same line and the gun goes off and everybody runs with the first step, in the same spot. It's just not the case.
Right. And there are many activities in which how you do initially doesn't necessarily predict ultimately whether you'll be unusually good.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I found, particularly with athletics, is that people who are extraordinarily gifted oftentimes don't excel because it seems to come too easy for them and they never develop the proper stamina for hard, difficult work. They shy away from that because if things aren't easy, here's a perfect example. People that are really gifted in one martial art, like someone who's gifted as a striker, well, they'll enter into mixed martial arts and find that they really are not very good at grappling. And so they don't like that feeling of being dominated in training, so they don't give it 100%. They don't throw themselves into it. Instead, they avoid it, and they try to find workarounds, and they're almost always defeated by grapplers. It's like they've because of the fact that they're gifted and talented, they've avoided the difficult, real character-building moments.